Great. So when we started, we talked a little bit about the pathways to change, to behavior change. And what I want to do during this session is zoom in on one of them in specific, which is the norms pathway. And this happens to be the one that we do the most work in rescue, but it's also, we work on all of them, but we do a lot of work in norms. But also it's one that we don't tend to talk as much about in public health. Because a lot of times in public health, when we talk about culture, we talk about norms, we talk about it at more of a macro scale. And sometimes those norms are not necessarily something at the macro scale that we need to change, but it's a lot more micro than that. It's subcultures. It's groups of people who are having disproportionate use of a risk behavior that we can change. We just have to kind of recognize where it is and who they are. So let's start by taking a step back and learning from one of the many industries that works against us every day. This one is the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry can actually teach us a whole lot about how norms can be changed towards or away from a specific behavior. So in this case, the way the tobacco industry markets is different than the way that we market. So here on the left, you see an example of a warning sign. This one's from, I think, either the UK or Australia. Typical kind of warning label, harms of tobacco use. An important message, but that message is a specific kind of message. It's educating you about the risks and the harms that could come from using that product. On the opposite side is a classic ad from Lucky Strike and how they're marketing themselves. And they're not necessarily marketing themselves talking about the benefits of using tobacco. They're marketing themselves based on the identity. And here we see Amelia Earhart talk as kind of a poster child, literally, for being an independent woman who smokes cigarettes, right? A key message that went on for 50, 60 years with multiple tobacco brands to get women to smoke. And so these are different strategies. And while it's necessary for us to always continue to educate people about the harms about tobacco, we don't always do as much of the other one as we could. And that is the process of denormalizing tobacco use in specific high-risk subcultures that in many cases were created by the tobacco industry themselves. So looking at the way the tobacco industry does their marketing, we see that it's very, very targeted. Marlboro is one thing. Marlboro is manly country culture. Now, it might be sold everywhere, but what you are buying with a pack of Marlboro is you are buying manliness, and you are buying ruggedness. And you could be in the most urban area possible, but smoking that Marlboro makes you feel a little bit that way by design. And you will always see their marketing and their advertising reinforce this. In contrast, we see brands like Camel presenting a different identity. An identity of alternative rock culture and of rebelliousness and of hipsterness, etc. And every time you see Camel, you're going to see this kind of advertising. But then when you look at brands like Kool and Newport, you're going to see a whole different kind of advertising. And this is going to be the advertising of hip-hop culture, of urban culture. Again, by design. So when we see this kind of marketing, what we realize is that it's not really about telling people why they should smoke. It's about making people feel that people like them are supposed to smoke. And if you feel down on yourself, if you're looking for ways to express yourself, if you're looking for ways to tell other people who you are, the tobacco industry is providing you an option of a way to define and present your identity to others. And that's a very powerful thing. And depending how much you want it and how much you need it, you may be willing to pay a whole lot more than our excise taxes could ever reach if you're someone who really wants to present that specific identity. But we don't have to necessarily just let it happen. We can learn from what the tobacco industry is doing. And one of the key lessons that the tobacco industry provides is that they use many different brands, right? So Philip Morris, Altria here, has one product across all of these brands, right? A cancer stick. And that one product is being sold in many more than just these packages, but in at least these 6 different packages. Different labels, different brands, different identities associated with each one of them. From a logical perspective, this is the exact same product, right? Maybe they've slightly tweaked the flavor or whatever, but it's the same product. Same goes with R.J. Reynolds and all of theirs, right? So on occasion, you'll see a Menthol will be used in one way and another. But for the most part, it's the exact same product. So why would these companies go through the expense and the effort of repackaging and remarketing a completely different brand of the same thing? They do it because they know that by doing that, they convince a whole different group of people to pay attention. A whole different group of people that weren't caught by Kool or by Camel. And they continue to do this. Up until the FDA's was able to regulate tobacco, we were still continuing to see more and more new brands from the tobacco industry to target new groups of people. Brands like Camel No. 9, for example, to reach more high fashion and LGBT individuals. So the tobacco industry very clearly knows that the way to cause success is to divide and conquer. Find these different identities and associate your product with those identities so that anyone who wants to express that identity can turn to you for help. Now, the challenge with this is that in the commercial world, there has never been a brand, not Nike or Apple or Coke, that appeals to everyone. So why do we continue to use one public health campaign to reach everyone? Right? Apple can't do it with their $1 billion, but my $10,000 is gonna do it. Right? So, if the commercial world can't do it, we might as well just conclude that it's not possible. No matter how broad and general your brand could be, you're still missing somebody. And the challenge is that oftentimes, as we showed in the center, when you aim for that center and try and reach the widest group possible, the people you miss often are the ones who need you the most. They're the fringes. The fringes who don't get communicated to as much, who don't have as many images of themselves in prevention messaging, who don't see themselves as a person who could be healthy. These are images that we sometimes inadvertently perpetuate by only focusing on kind of the average-looking person in our marketing. So, how do we reach these at-risk youth and young adults? And how do we use these lessons from the tobacco industry to cause change? The first thing we have to kind of think about is that who you are often motivates behavior more powerfully than what you know. So what does this mean? Is that each and every one of us has an identity. And our identity guides us on how to dress, on how to act, where we hang out, where we don't hang out, how we act at the office, how we act at home, how we act maybe in our religious institutions, how we act if we're still students, all these different places that we go, that we live, we have identities that we project. And that's part of being human. It has been part of our history since tribes were doing all sorts of things to define their own identities, right? But it's not a bad thing. It's part of being human, and if not, then we would all be dressed the exact same way in the most utilitarian way possible and would drive the same cars and all that stuff, right? But we don't. We don't because we all have identities. And when you're a young person, particularly an at-risk young person, your identity is driving so many behaviors. It's motivating you to, because you're just defining it. You're unsure of who you are. So you're having to prove to your others and to yourself mostly who it is that you are and who it is that you want to be. And so this powerful driver can make you ignore all those things that might be logically wrong with your decision and decide, but I want to feel that way. So I want to feel the way this product is going to make me feel, so I'm going to use it. Now, sometimes this is harmless, right? Sometimes it's the difference between wearing a leather jacket or not, or wearing the newest sneakers or not. But other times it's things like tobacco, violence, alcohol, drug use, all of these kind of risk behaviors that occur in the social environment that have social meaning to them, and that young people are doing because they want to define themselves a certain way. So this is what we call kind of the identity cycle, to help us understand how behavior and identity can kind of come together in a simple way. At the top, we have our multidimensional identity. And this multidimensional identity spans, who you are at school, who you are at home, who you are with your friends, etc. All connected as part of the same overall arching identity. And we seek out experiences with others who are achieving that identity more successfully than we are. Right? So if I want to be the best student at school and I want to be known for that, I'm going to look maybe a year or two older than me and I'm going to see what were they doing. Okay, and I'm going to learn. They were going to clubs, they were staying after school, they were raising their hand in class. I need to make sure to do that stuff too. So I start to associate those things with that identity and I emulate those things I start to receive reinforcements, and the cycle continues and goes round and round throughout our lives. But maybe the identity I want is I want to be rebellious. I want to show people that I'm rebellious. So I start to have experiences with others who are rebellious, and I start to learn from them. Oh, I should try cigarettes. I should ditch class. I should act up. I should get attention in this way or in that way. And this cycle continues to reinforce itself and go round and round. Now, the reason I gave you those two examples is because I want you to know that the cycle isn't the problem. The cycle is simply how we as humans learn how to be a part of these social groups and how to have the identities that we want. The challenge is that when people want certain identities, there are risk behaviors that as a society we have associated with them. So to be a rebel, it's not just wearing a leather jacket and staying out late. We have allowed the association of things like tobacco use and drug use to be a part of that identity. Hip-hop culture, we've allowed certain things to be associated with that culture. It doesn't mean that it has to be, it just means that those have become a package. And so now when people want to have that identity for themselves, those other kind of at-risk behaviors sometimes come with them. So one way to kind of segment these groups and better understand what's going on is this idea called peer crowds. And peer crowds it exists in the literature, and we've been using it for a long time. And the definition that we use for this is that they're the macro level connections between peer groups with similar interests, lifestyles, influencers, and habits. So while a teen has his or her peer group that he belongs to, both the teen and the peer group belong to a larger peer crowd that shares significant cultural similarities across geographic areas. Okay, so this explains why, and we've done research on peer crowds all over the country, done a little bit of research in Canada as well. This explains why we can go to a high school in the middle of Los Angeles and go to another high school in Maine and another one in Florida and go to the lunchroom and we will find a table of goth kids. It'll be small, but they'll be there. And we can find another table of preppy kind of jockish kids. They'll be there, and they'll have similar interests, similar habits, similar lifestyles. They've never met. Right? They're in completely different parts of the country, but they share these similarities. So as we've done this research around the country, we found that we typically find 5 or 6 peer crowds no matter where we go. The first peer crowd that we always find, we call it mainstream. And the way that we do research is based on photos only. So these terms I'm about to share with you are just what we use to discuss them. And sometimes teens use these words to describe them too, but we only use photos in our research. So the mainstream group is the largest one, followed by preppy, hip-hop, alternative, country, and then occasionally we find the LGBT group. What we tend to find with LGBT is that sometimes it's too small in high school, but we always see it when we do young adult research. So it's sometimes there, sometimes isn't. So the mainstream group, our biggest group, is kind of the teen every parent wants. All right? This is the teen that's a part of clubs, they're a part of sports, usually the non-flashy sports. They like kind of middle-of-the-road things like brands like Gap and Aeropostale, and some of them are gamers, some of them are more academic, some of them are not. The main thing that kind of brings them together is that their social status is not quite as important to them as it is to other teens. Now, this does not mean that they're not cool. Some of them are, and some of them are not. What it means is that simply to them, their prioritization is that I'm not going to do whatever it takes to be popular. Maybe I'm naturally popular, maybe I'm not, but to me, I have other things that are more important to me than my social status. So, ideal teen, try and raise mainstream teens. But our kind of a cousin to mainstream is the preppy teen or the partier teen. And the preppy partier teen, they look a lot like mainstream teens. They're a little bit more fashionable. They like a little bit more specific of brands. They try harder to look a certain way. This is where you typically see the jock and the cheerleader. The kind of quarterback cheerleader relationship tends to be in the preppy crowd more so than anywhere else. And they're more in tune with pop culture. So this is MTV's target audience. This is who a lot of corporate brands actually market to because they tend to be a little bit more affluent, and so they have more consumer power. So this is like the ideal group for if you're trying to sell Oreos or Lay's or Coke, this is who you want to sell it to because they're going to be buying the most of this kind of product. The next group that we see is alternative. And alternative is a lot of subgroups that share very similar values. Groups that are called things like goth, rocker, hipster, emo, skater, punk, and many other terms. But what brings them together is kind of their countercultureness. that they believe that they are different from particularly preppy mainstream kids. They don't like to be like them, so they work hard to be different from them, but they also value kind of the individuality and uniqueness of people. So they like local art, they like local music, they tend to be very creative, artistic people, and they tend to see particularly the preppy group kind of as more like clones of each other, and they don't like that. So they try to express themselves in their own individual way. The next group is our country group. Rural is there as kind of a descriptor of their identity, not necessarily their geography, because not every rural kid is country. But these young people, they love the outdoors. They are very independent, or they like to describe themselves that way. They value freedom. They wear camo, even when they're not hunting. And they tend to kind of have, they kind of have political leanings that are a little bit more conservative. And that actually is really important for when we talk about prevention messages, and we'll get to that. But they have a kind of a more conservative, traditionalist view of the world. And that's what they care about. And the second to last group is hip hop. Our hip hop youth tend to be more likely to be multicultural, but there's plenty of Caucasian teens here as well, and multicultural teens are in every group. These teens, there are many words that they may use to describe themselves and that others use to describe them, but the common thread is that they kind of see the world as maybe some of the world is against them. They have to work harder than others. They were born with a disadvantage, not their own personal, but kind of in their environment, and they have to fight for what they're going to get. And so a lot of the way that they kind of see the world is that they have something and I don't, and I'm going to fight and I'm going to get it and I'm going to prove myself that I'm just as good no matter what. And so there's a really strong attitude in this, an attitude of sometimes being misunderstood, but of wanting to prove themselves. And the last group, LGBT, is one of the fastest evolving groups because of how fast culture is evolving around LGBT. These teens in high school particularly tend to be dispersed in the other peer crowds because there's not enough LGBT teens in most high schools to form their own group, so they tend to be friends with others and kind of hang out. And so a lot of times when we talk to LGBT young adults, what we'll find out is that they are from LGBT peer crowd, and they tend to have one other peer crowd that's heavily influencing them because that's where they were kind of in high school. So in high school, you'll tend to find them in any of the other groups. So these are our 6 peer crowds. Now, let me tell you that this isn't just about teens. We find very similar peer crowds with young adults. They're a little bit more refined. There's a few more. But it's also about adults. And so adults, we don't like to think of ourselves this way as much, but there are many issues that we deal with that have to do with the identity of the adults that we're trying to reach. So why do peer crowds matter so much? Well, it's more than just their clothing or the music that they listen to. It's really about their values. So our research has mostly focused on who teens are today. But we have theories about where peer crowds come from, and we hope over time we will get to do more and more of this kind of research. But what we believe is that it begins with life experiences that shape their attitudes first. And that children are growing up with certain attitudes, certain views on the world, whether it's that I'm creative or that I'm getting picked on or I'm good at sports or whatever it is that their kind of worldview is being shaped as they're growing up in elementary school. And as they get into middle school and those attitudes are formed, they start to find like others. And those like others are first similar in their values and attitudes and how they see the world, and not necessarily in their peer crowd. We tend to see a lot of fluctuation in middle school and early high school between peer crowds. I don't know if anyone has ever had a teenager at home who one summer decided they can no longer wear anything in their closet, right? The next school year had to be completely new. That tends to be a peer crowd revelation of some kind. So they're exploring, they're looking for different peer crowds, and they kind of settle on it, but their peer crowd was almost predetermined based on the attitudes that they developed growing up. And so these are really deep values. Values that they find those like others, and they figure out, okay, what do people like me do? They dress this way, they go to these kinds of places, they do these kinds of things, and that's where a lot of the behaviors come from. It's that those behaviors are the norms within the peer crowd, and the peer crowd is driven by those values. So the good thing about this is that the behaviors are the last bit. So the behaviors are actually the most changeable part of all of this. We just have to understand what those values and attitudes were that drove them to be a part of that peer crowd and to engage in that behavior. So let me show you a quick case study of some data so you can kind of see how this works. So we use those same photos in surveys, something we call the I-based survey, to measure how many teens are influenced by a specific peer crowd. And this is from 2011. We actually just finished collecting data as part of Virginia's Youth Tobacco Survey for 2015-16. So we'll have new data soon. But from 2011, this is what we saw in the statewide sample of Virginia high school students. So about 54% of teens identified with preppy, 35% mainstream, hip hop, alternative, and country. So the smallest were hip hop, alternative, and country. And this does not add up to 100% because the way the survey works, it accounts for overlapping influence. So you can be both hip hop and preppy, for example, and that allows for that. So then we measured tobacco use, which was the focus of this study. And what we found was that tobacco use was very much disproportionately distributed. So preppy and mainstream teens were the least likely ones to use tobacco, and the most likely ones were hip hop, alternative, and country. And by multiples, right? But we looked even deeper and we said, okay, so tobacco use is over here, but these are pretty small groups. There's still a huge group of preppy teens who are smoking. So, where should we focus our dollars? So we looked deeper into the data and we found this is it's a continuous variable, so you can get up to 12 points, hip hop points or preppy points, et cetera. And what we found was that for every additional point, their risk changed. For every point, one more point that someone was preppy, their risk of cigarette smoking went down 15%. For every point in mainstream, it went down 24%. But for every point they were hip hop, it went up 5, alternative 6, country 5. And it gets even more interesting when we start looking at specific tobacco products. Chew tobacco only went up for country. Every point you went up on the country scale, you were 18% more likely to chew tobacco. Cigarillos, it was hip hop that was driving that use with 14%. And any tobacco use was hip hop first, then country, then alternative. And so what we found here was that even though there were still some mainstream and preppy teens who used tobacco products, those tended to be teens that were sharing influence with one of these other peer crowds. And they were tending to pull that influence from one of these peer crowds. So putting our epidemiologist hats on, right? Think about it like a virus. So if cigarette smoking is a virus, and you were an epidemiologist tasked with tackling that virus, what would you do? Go to the source of it, right? You'd go to the epicenter. Where is this virus coming from? It's coming from here. Tobacco use is coming from these fringe peer crowds. And there's nothing wrong with these peer crowds. These kids are just identifying with people who are similar to them. The problem is that this is where tobacco use continues to come from and continues to spread amongst young people. So when we're talking about any risk behavior where there's 10 to 20, even 25% of people who do it, we're not talking about the average person. We're talking about someone who is abnormal, right? Because the norm is not to do it. So if we're looking at abnormal people, we have to look at the fringes of culture and not necessarily the dead center of it. We looked further to understand how peer crowds predict tobacco use compared to demographics. And for 2 of the 3 behaviors, it had almost a 2 times stronger predictive value of tobacco use over all the demographics we measured, which were age, geography, gender, and ethnicity. So for cigarette smoking, 4% of the variance was explained by demographics, 7.8% by peer crowds. Cigarillo smoking, the only one that was inverse was chew tobacco, which was 10.9% explained by demographics, which was simply being male. That was kind of driving that predictive value strength, while 5.8% was still added on by peer crowds. So peer crowds told us even more than simply being the demographics of who chews tobacco. Because again, not every rural teen is country. And if they're not country, they're very unlikely to chew tobacco, no matter how rural their community is.
Just want you to know, if you need anything, don't be shy, okay? There are no rules in this house. I'm not like a regular mom. I'm a cool mom. Right, Regina?
Please stop talking.
Okay. I'm gonna make you girls a hump day treat.
So, she's a cool mom, right? Well, cool moms and cool dads are a peer crowd amongst adults. And that peer crowd is responsible for a lot of adults giving alcohol to young people. And so peer crowds have much bigger influence than just teens and young adults. They also influence adults, and we just have to continue to do more research on them. So how does this affect our messaging and our strategy? Well, social branding is the strategy that we use to try and change norms within these peer crowds. And the strategy is, we call it a behavior change marketing strategy to change norms that utilize peer crowd targeted social brands, right? So these brands are hyper-focused on one peer crowd to associate healthy behaviors with peer crowd values. Okay, so we're looking for the values that they have that are, for the most part, hard to change. We don't want to change their values. We want to find values that go against the risk behavior and associate that value with being healthy. They all have values that support being healthy. We just have to find them. So how it works is our social brand is introduced into the process as a role model, the same way that they look up to other role models. And we introduce the new behaviors as that new brand. So we have to be cool to them first. And we become cool within their peer crowd. And this is why it's so critical that we're peer crowd targeted, because it's very hard for one group to think you're cool if you're trying to be cool to everybody, right? It's hard to be friends with everybody at a deep level. So you gotta focus on that one group and define yourself as the kind of ultimate culturally for that group. And then you're able to introduce new behaviors as a member of their community rather than as the kind of adult outsider as sometimes campaigns are perceived to be. And then you reinforce that process. When we look at our common kind of methods that we use in communications and in behavior change marketing, we separate them into what we call behavior message delivery channels and experience channels, where the delivery channels are kind of getting the message of the value out there, but the experience channels in the center are where you see that other people like you are changing how they interpret the behavior within the culture. So you're seeing that other hip hop kids are deciding to stand up against tobacco use, or that other country teens are deciding that chew doesn't associate with their identity. And these are really important things for you to see if we want our teens or young adults to believe that norm change is happening. Now, so let me show you very quickly how this gets operationalized just from a TV ad perspective. Obviously, this is much deeper, but this is kind of a nice packaged way to show you the differences. So first, I'm going to show you an old, kind of more mainstream targeted message. So let's start there.
One in 3 kids who smoke will die from it.
Will die from it. So, who was the peer crowd in that video? Who was it? The flannel. Flannel made you think a little country? Mainstream. All right. Yeah. So mainstream, maybe a little preppy, maybe slightly country, but it was kind of center of the road, right? So we have these center of the road mainstream teens that are dying from tobacco use, right? But these mainstream teens are the ones that are least likely to smoke, right? So if you're going to put 3 kids in a boat, at least put like some alternative kids in there or something, right? These poor mainstream, healthy mainstream kids. So what happens is that when we try and go for the center, it's hard for us to create a visual or a message that appeals to some of these fringe groups who are going to look at that ad and say, like, let's say you're a punk rock teenager who smokes because you want to be rebellious, and you see that. Is that telling you not to smoke? Is it reinforcing why you smoke? Yes. And that's the problem, is that if we continue to see kind of the center of culture performs a behavior a certain way, whether it's exercise or not smoking or not binge drinking or whatever it is, and you see yourself as different from them, then we're inadvertently reinforcing that norm that this group does that and this group does that other thing. And what we want to do is show them, use a mirror and show them themselves being healthy, so that they can see that it is possible within their group, that they don't have to change the way they dress and the music they listen to and the things that they like in order to possibly be a cool, healthy person. So let's see what that looks like.
There's nothing better than growing up in a small town.
Everybody knows everybody. If I'm broke down or something like that, they're always there to help me.
People here usually take care of each other and care about each other because we lived here our whole lives.
So when I heard that 1,300 Americans die each day because of tobacco, I couldn't help but think about my hometown. In fact, that's more than the population of half of Vermont's towns. I don't want to see anyone from my town killed off by tobacco. That's why I choose to live tobacco-free.
So, This is Down and Dirty, a country-focused brand. Again, trying to pull those values, those traditionalist country values, and associate them with living tobacco-free. Now, the opposite extreme, here's Blacklist, which is an alternative targeted brand.
Their advertisements make it seem like they love animals, but in reality, they tortured animals. They tested cigarettes on monkeys, rabbits, and dogs. In one study, they strapped beagles down and cut their throats open to permanently install a tube that forced the dogs to smoke cigarettes. This filled their bodies with tar that caused some of the dogs to develop cancer. Thousands of beagles, rabbits, and other animals died in experiments just like this one. They used these experiments to make cigarettes even more addictive so that we would get hooked younger and harder. So you want to know why we support a smoke-free scene? Because we're not okay with animal cruelty to make tobacco products more addictive. For more on big tobacco and animal cruelty, check out the Blacklisters on Facebook and leave a comment.
So a completely different message. Now we're focusing on kind of that countercultureness, that standing up for the little guy, standing up for people who can't protect themselves, because that's what alternative culture is about, right? They're about being different and about kind of protecting their own. So totally different message. And the last one, which Kathy alluded to earlier, which is our hip hop campaign with the FDA, is for a different peer crowd, in this case, hip hop.
You see, my mom's double shift wasn't in vain. Low achiever, at risk, disregarded. I will break that chain. Pain, disease, death, cigarettes were to blame. But I overcame the block. And the shock when my grandpa's lung cancer caused by cigarettes was caught. Distraught and left alone. Had 3 generations in one home. Not broken, but awoken. Setting sights on CEO of independence as my goal. So I reject cigarettes to regain control.
Keep it fresh. Live tobacco-free.
Oh. So, as you can see, they're totally different messages for totally different audiences, because the goal is for them to see themselves in health, in a healthy alternative. So, with generally targeted messages, we can inadvertently reinforce some of these norms, but by changing these messages and focusing on these subcultures, we can kind of get past this idea that there's good kids and bad kids and start to show that no matter how saggy your pants are, no matter how late you stay out at night, no matter how rock and roll your music is, that you can do all of that and live a healthy life. So thank you very much.